Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back, as is Drew Deach. We're talking all about Cat's Eye today, which is a feature film that includes 3 stories from Stephen King. 2 were collected in Night Shift, and 1 is original to the screenplay. Drew, what made you choose this feature film to talk about, even though it's sort of just 3 shorts put together?
Well, as listeners will know from Creepshow, I'm a sucker for anthology films, and I think that Cat's Eye is actually kind of a minorly important movie for the Stephen King filmography. He's writing the script, adapting a couple of his short stories, but also there are a lot of factors that go into this movie that I think start to really build the idea of a cinematic interconnectivity to Stephen King's works. And I think that's kind of fascinating. It might be more fascinating than the actual movie, but,
Yeah.
it's directed by Louis Teague, who had directed Cujo. There's this whole opening sequence that has cameos from Cujo and Christine, and at one point, we see The Dead Zone, the film, playing on a television. So I think for that alone, Cat's Eye is kind of remarkable at this point for Stephen King on film, because it's the first time that I think there is a knowing, almost wink wink at the audience. Like, hey, isn't it fun that all these things exist together? We're kind of rewarding you for being Stephen King nerds.
And that's something he's done in his books for a very long time. He's always getting very meta with it, You'll have someone reading a Stephen King book in a Stephen King book or something like that.
and while that is certainly a little self-congratulatory, it's part of what I think is what readers of his love. It's like, trying to piece together all these connections and where certain towns lie on a map in relation to each other. It's why we get something like the show Castle Rock, where it's just, that's kind of the big selling point. But Cat's Eye, I think, is the first, I would venture to say, the first time on film that it is so in your face. It's not like these are little Easter eggs you have to really be squinting to find. It's right out the gate. Like, here's Cujo, here's Christine. If you don't know it's Christine, the car has a bumper sticker that says, "I am Christine."
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we can kind of get into the film in general, especially like I said, because this is, Stephen King has the sole writing credit on it. So this is pretty much straight from his brain.
That gives off the impression, too, that these are going to be pretty accurate to the stories for the first 2. And because I have read so many things at this point, I don't remember the exact details of Quitters Inc., but what I do remember of it, this seemed very accurate to the story, because this is a story about going to the extreme, or, I'd probably phrase it as beyond the extreme, to cure someone's addiction to cigarettes. And you get these moments where you can tell that these characters are kind of like, this is crazy. And you get that feeling while you're watching it too. You're like, this is way, way too far. And it's still enjoyable for some of it. And I do think, some of the moments in this movie throughout the 3 stories were a little too over the top for my liking, but at the same time, they had to do that, I think, to make these stories work.
Quitters Inc. sets a really kind of bizarre precedent for the rest of the movie, because I will call almost anything horror, and there are horror elements in Cat's Eye, but this is almost like King at his purest expression of dark humor. It's not really a movie that's trying to scare you so much as it's kind of trying to make you laugh and then feel guilty about laughing. And Quitters Inc. is like sets that tone, because the whole setup being that James Woods plays this character, Dick Morrison, who wants to quit smoking, and he's exhausted all of their options. So he goes to this company, Quitters Inc., that they're going to do it. Like, they're going to change your life, but he doesn't know exactly what their methods are. And if if you're not sure that this already sounds like a wacky, over the top setup, when he walks into Quitters Inc., the slogan of the company on their office is the final solution, which carries with it some pretty dark connotation, but it sets up, it's like, okay, this is going to be weird and twisted. And James Woods, he sees this really distraught guy sitting in the lobby who gets his wife back and they look super pale. And it's all played for really dark comedy. And I like that attempt, but I think it's kind of a one note joke. And that can work, I think, in a short story literary form, but trying to have it cinematically and have sort of an arc, it's a little bit weaker. And I think that's why probably the best part of Quitters Inc. is this moment where James Woods is at a party and he just sees smoking everywhere, and it just starts going over the top, where his friend, played by James Rebhorn, is like smoking like 40 cigarettes or something.
Yeah.
And smoke's blowing out of his ears, and giant cigarette cartons are walking around dancing, and there's just like cigarettes littered all over the floor. He imagines this weird musical it's totally cartoon nuts, and it's like, okay, yeah, this is a fun interpretation of trying to get over some kind of addiction, and it just totally owning you. But narratively, it's
Yeah. I think that's how I've felt about a lot of this movie, and we'll definitely talk about it more as a whole at the end. But with Quitters Inc., you have these fantastic cast members, and I would say actually throughout, you have some pretty big names who pop up in these stories. And when you have James Woods and Alan King going back and forth together, you can tell there's something there, but I don't think they fully capitalize on it, because then you have Alan King just going very over the top, and James Woods is clearly trying to play it cool but also keep up with him at the same time. And there was this banter that I think they could have explored a little more, and it would have made those moments a little better. But then you have that moment at the end too, where you can tell that Dick isn't taking the thing too seriously, even after his wife is taken, because she ends up fine afterwards. But then they make the comment about cutting off a pinky or something like that, and they make the toast to Quitters Inc., and then he sees the wife missing part of her finger,
which feels like the punchline of a dark joke. It doesn't feel like a narrative conclusion arc, like, oh yeah, they really will do this. It's like, well, we've seen that the entire premise of this company is that they will kidnap your family and torture them if you smoke a cigarette. We know they'll do that. So this reveal at the end of, oh my gosh, they really will cut off someone's pinky, doesn't have an emotionally satisfying punch. It's funny, like it's horribly grotesquely funny, but that's really about it. And I think if the work between Dick and his wife Cindy, played by Mary Darcy, if that had been stronger, I think maybe the emotional stakes would have felt more real. But it really is kind of just a lark of an idea. And so I can't imagine that there was an intention for this to pay off as kind of like, oh man, that really, sucked the wind out of the audience or anything. It's like, no, this is kind of a wacky, over the top joke, and probably one that has some basis in reality. Like when I was watching it this time, I was thinking about like those companies, that this is a real thing, those companies who you can hire to kidnap you.
Yeah.
And like, and it's like, oh, okay. So this idea of crazy extreme companies, like giving your life over to them is certainly a fascinating thing to explore. But I think King's approach is just to do it as a joke, and as a joke, it works, but as something that has kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end, satisfying wise, I think it's pretty shaky.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to quickly note too that Drew Barrymore's appearance in this one is very, very brief. Basically, the cat is staring at a mannequin in a storefront window, and all of a sudden Drew Barrymore sort of morphs into the mannequin, kind of, or over the mannequin. It's a very weird effect that I was like, okay, so clearly you just wanted to get Drew Barrymore in all of these stories, even though the first one didn't really feel like it had a purpose. It's like, okay, so the cat is going to go find this girl. Cool.
Well, it's interesting. Apparently, there was a prologue that they cut out of the movie that was going to start the movie, and it's about why this cat is trying to find this girl and what its entire kind of purpose in the story is. I mean, I kind of love the fact that the opening of Cat's Eye is a cat's eye opening. That's my kind of like, yeah, it's clever and fun and sets a good mood, but yeah, the cat sees her manifest into this like ghost mannequin thing, and then Drew Barrymore does play James Woods' daughter, who's at the
Oh yes, yeah. I forgot about that part.
I think it's called Saint Stephen.
Yeah, so it's like a nod to Stephen King within the movie that he clearly wrote in himself. But yeah, I mean, see the moment with his wife and his daughter were so not memorable. I was like, oh yeah, that happened. And I literally just watched this the other day and I already forgot about it. But so she plays kind of like two different characters, because the one you see in the storefront does not look like the daughter at the school. It looks more like the Drew Barrymore we see in the final sequence.
Well, and I think that's because the cat continues to see her pop up in different ways. And it's like, okay, it's leading her to this little girl for a reason when we get to the last story. But yeah, I think that was my biggest problem with Quitters Inc. Like that moment he like goes to this academy because it appears that his daughter is like has special needs or something. And so she's at this, special school, and he's bringing her a gift, and then sees Alan King, kind of menacingly watching him, because earlier when he was signing up for, he's like, oh, you didn't state on your entry form where your daughter goes to school. So it's like, oh, they know where she is. They can get a hold of her. And I think, again, if there was stronger work in making me care about, Dick and his family as like real people, then maybe there would be more weight to the piece that beyond just being kind of an over the top gag. But this segment never really gets there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think it's time to move on to The Ledge, because this story is a story that has the tables turned. And I mean, you spend a lot of time with this building and its ledges and a pigeon.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I love Creepshow, and I was on the Creepshow episode for this, and I've seen Cat's Eye before, and this time around I realized like, oh, The Ledge is very clearly a sort of riff on the segment from Creepshow, Something to Tide You Over, where it's this very rich, over the top, like bad guy.
Yeah.
And instead of Leslie Nielsen, this time it's played by Kenneth McMillan. His character's name's Kressner. And he finds out that his wife has been having an affair with this guy, this younger, good-looking guy, played by Robert Hayes. His name is Johnny Norris, and he's this kind of washed-up tennis player and calls himself a tennis bum, which I think is just funny. And Kressner has decided to kidnap Johnny and make him this bet of like, hey, if you can walk out on this ledge on the top of this building and walk around the entire building and come back, I'll give you a bunch of money and you can have my wife. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is very much another framework, just like Something to Tide You Over. Except this one is obviously not supernatural and a little bit more straightforward. And again, this is another one where I'm like, I bet the actual short story is pretty good. I have a horrible fear of heights, so I can understand the inherent terror of this idea. And I like the set work, that they do to make this kind of forced perspective when they show a bunch of the kind of bird's eye view shots looking down at the street. That's all model work. Obviously it's not, actually as far as it's portraying. So I like all that. That's very kind of old school Hollywood.
Yeah.
But this is another one where the idea kind of stops at itself, where it's like, well, wouldn't it be creepy or crazy if somebody had to do that? I'm like, yeah, it would be. Okay.
I think the thing with these two stories so far is that visually it's something you can pull off in a movie, but plot wise, there's just not enough meat there to really make you care about these characters. It's like, okay, this guy is going to walk around the ledge. It is very, very windy. And you get that in the sound that they're using. You know, you can hear the high
Mm-hmm.
pitched wind because they're making it seem like they're so high up. And then you have this crazy criminal who is shooting him with a fire hose and doing all these crazy things to try and make him fall off. And you know, it's a little unrealistic that as many times as he lost his balance, he did not fall off. And I think the first time it happened, it almost looked like his shirt was attached to the wall. I don't
I
know
would
if you
not be
caught that at
surprised.
all, but
Yeah, when he
it was
does
like there was like a
the bend back.
string from the shirt to the wall. And I was like, yeah, no, he would have fallen already.
Yeah, this feels kind of like it's homaging specifically some older Hitchcock films, you know, like Vertigo, and I can't remember the one right now, but there's one that takes place on the torch of the Statue of Liberty, where it's just all of this, you know, big set work and fear of heights and falling, and I can appreciate the artifice of it as just like a fun concept, but like you said, again, I don't think there's enough meat on the character's bones to make me care about them beyond pure human empathy of like, I feel bad that that guy has to walk across this ledge, but you know, there's no real good establishment of the relationship that Johnny has with Kressner's wife. Like the only I would actually say Kenneth McMillan probably comes out looking the best because before his story kind of kicks off proper, we get a sense of him as a character because him and another person see our lead cat trying to cross a busy intersection, and they start taking bets about like, oh yeah, I bet you the cat will make it, I bet you it won't. And it's like, okay, so this is a guy who is a high roller. He has he has money to burn, and he'll bet on something that's clearly cruel. And it's like, oh, okay, I get that character right out the gate. In a way, I really do think he might be he gets the best characterization of anyone in the movie.
Oh, absolutely. And while, you know, there isn't a ton story wise, it's mostly just bad guy wants to have fun. And this is how he has fun because he has way too much money, clearly, and he can't just have fun like a normal person and just go gamble or go see a movie or go see one of the Vegas shows or in this case Atlantic City shows,
Right.
which is a very similar feel either way. You know, it's like, you know what, maybe take a break from Atlantic City and go to Vegas and go hang out with those rich people or do something else. Don't bet on a cat making it across the street or have some guy walk around a building's ledge. Like, there are other ways to have fun, but he's too cruel to do that.
And I can understand from an actor's perspective the glee of getting to play someone who there's no moral grayness about. It's like, no, this guy's a bad guy and I'm going to play him, you know, completely cartoonishly. And that's fun. There's some fun gag stuff in The Ledge with Robert Hayes, you know, having to find a little cranny to hide in, or this pigeon that starts pecking at him, and there's a really cruel, but I laughed shot of him kicking the pigeon, and they just, you know, shoot a bunch of feathers out of an air gun to simulate that. And it's it's again, there's that dark humor, and I think I would assume audiences kind of showing up for this with Stephen King's name on it and some other stuff that we'll get into in the last story. They expect like, yeah, this is going to be another horror supernatural monster thing, and it's like, well, these are really just, at least with these first two stories, they're just dark gags.
Yeah.
And King loves that, but I think that the issue again in The Ledge is characterization. It's like, yeah, the actors do what they can and they have fun with it, but I don't think it ever gets to a point in the writing where we end up really being on anybody's side other than, oh, we're on their side just because they've been put in this over the top horrible situation that you would feel for anybody in that situation, but the movie never makes a case for why we should feel about, you know, feel for these specific people.
I think one of the things that King is really good at when he has a lot more space to work with is that characterization that's missing
Mm-hmm.
here. And obviously, with these being short stories, he doesn't have as much time to even do that within the stories themselves. You know, this isn't The Stand or The Talisman where you are spending hours upon hours reading about these characters and really getting to know them. You have, maybe 20 to 30 minutes with most of these characters, and especially in the short stories, because from what I can recall, none of them are too terribly long, at least in the night shift. You do have some that are longer, some that are shorter, but if you're working off of something that's only 20, 30 pages tops, that's not a ton of time as far as story goes. And, Stephen King isn't a brilliant screenwriter at this point necessarily, because writing a book and writing a screenplay are two totally different formats. And I think it's something that, he wanted to dive into because he wanted to have control over how these stories were told. And that's something I completely understand, but it's just one of those things where you're like, yeah, you can kind of tell when someone else adapts his work that they're more familiar with the format.
Well, it comes down to a couple things for me with this, but before we get into the last segment that I think is important to note is that this is directed by Louis Teague, who directed Cujo, and Cujo is one of the better Stephen King adaptations. It's very good. And then you look at something like Creepshow, which I think is a good comparison for Cat's Eye, because it's another anthology movie, and Stephen King has the sole writing credit on the Creepshow script as well as Cat's Eye. And I think with Creepshow, Stephen King gets that these are, four color, lurid, over the top cartoon horror stories. And that's why the best stuff in Creepshow actually manages to find small, good character in the best pieces, because it's allowed to kind of breathe because of its over the top genre elements. But with Cat's Eye, I think the combination of the type of stories that King is adapting, and specifically Louis Teague's direction, hamper it. Because I think if you had direction that really matched the tone of these pieces on the script, they might be able to shine more. You might be able to find more heightened moments where you could inject real characterization. And that's why I think the best thing in the entire movie is that party sequence in Quitters Inc., because it's the one time the movie really goes cartoony.
They just go all in.
Right. And the script and tone match each other well. And I think with The Ledge, there needed to be way more kind of seeing things from Robert Hayes' perspective, like really giving us an exaggerated idea of his fear of falling. I think if there was more of that, it might be a little bit more enjoyable. But again, as is, it's terrible to say, but it's another one where it's like it's fine. Like,
Yeah.
it's about as much enthusiasm as I can muster for it.
Yeah, I think for me, The General was the better of the three as far as putting it on the screen, because it was original to the movie too. I think that partially helped. And it's the most we see of Drew Barrymore as well. I believe in The Ledge, she pops up on TV.
Yeah, she's in a commercial, which the cat sits and dutifully watches.
Yeah, exactly. So you have the cat's story basically leading up to this moment, because the cat was really just a vehicle to get from one story to the next. And then it finally has a larger role in The General. And this is the story where I feel like you get to know Drew Barrymore's character probably more than I would say the rest that we see, because she's this girl who, they clearly are pretty well off. They live in a nice big house in the suburbs, and she just really wants this cat and wants to care for this cat. And that's something that I think a lot of kids end up wanting. Wanting a pet when you're a kid seems like a pretty natural thing. So you get this moment where she's like, can we keep him, please, please? And you could tell the parents aren't too thrilled about it. And I felt like this was a very realistic moment. until we get to the troll, which we will get to in a moment. But, as far as from the character's perspective, you can tell there's some tension between the parents because the dad makes fun of the mom's mother and her accent and everything, and the mom gets upset about it, and there's this sort of tension going on where you can tell that the dad isn't handling things the way the mom wants him to, but he's trying to just make his daughter feel better. And there's definitely a lot of disdain for this cat coming from the mother too. And it's not even the cat's fault. The cat doesn't do anything.
No. Yeah, cats, the general, as the short is called in the movie, it's very clear. This is what the movie was sold on. If you look at the poster art, everything, it's the cat with the troll. It's like, this is what people were coming to see. And General feels like it's in another movie. I mean, tonally, at the script level, the kind of story it's telling, it feels out of place for the first two movies, the first two stories that we just watched. And as kind of a whole, I think that's a problem. But on its own, General reminded me of like a really solid episode of something like Tales from the Dark Side, which was an anthology horror series produced by George Romero that's basically kind of the Creep Show television series. And, or like a Tales from the Crypt or the 80s Twilight Zone. It feels like a solid little episode. And a lot of that has to do with the simplicity of the idea. There is this cat that has been sent to protect this little girl from an evil troll that's trying to steal her breath, which will kill her. And of course, whenever the troll comes out and does a bunch of stuff, the parents don't see it and they think it's the cat doing the mischief and causing all these problems. It's like, oh, great. This would be a perfectly acceptable episode of an anthology TV show. And as a standalone sequence in the movie, it's the best. Like, I think it's made better just by comparison, because I think on its own, it's solid. I think a lot of that has to do with the actual troll monster. It was the facial animatronic design was done by Carlo Rambaldi, who has done tons of monsters, for example, Alien and E.T. So when we get those close-ups of the troll's face snarling, it's like, oh yeah, it's a cool, gnarly looking monster.
Yeah, plus with the set, how they made the troll look so small was they made a life-size version of it and then made the set 8 times larger than what it actually was so that the troll would look tiny. And then they kind of blended that in with the scenes that have Drew Barrymore in her bed in the normal size set and everything like that. And that was an expensive project for them to take on. It was $150,000 just for that. And, this movie has a budget of $6 million, and you have to figure with names like James Woods, Robert Hayes, Alan King, so on and so forth, and even possibly Drew Barrymore at this point, because she's already been in notable movies. She's probably going to get a decent chunk of money for being a kid. And then you have that scene, and it's just like, okay, yeah, I see why this budget ended up being $6 million, and it didn't do so hot at the box office.
No, I think again that it's hard to market this kind of a movie. I'm sure a lot of the marketing centered around the troll segment, because the rest of it really wasn't the kind of stuff that cinematically Stephen King's brand was associated with. I mean, you have Drew Barrymore just, I think, in the year before this in Firestarter, another kind of Carrie riff. And now she's showing up in another Stephen King movie. Well, you think it's going to be another big supernatural thing. And it's like, not really. There's one supernatural story at the end, but it's not one that has any kind of recognition from book readers because it's something that's completely original. And the others are such kind of tertiary short stories in Stephen King's bibliography. They're not these kind of mammoth short stories that would end up being the basis for really huge stuff like you and I talked about, like Children of the Corn. So you mentioned the set work in general, and it's tons of fun. It's that kind of pre Honey I Shrunk the Kids, Incredible Shrinking Man type stuff where it's like, oh, they got to make big, giant versions of things like dictionaries and kids' toys and stuff. And that's all really fun. The compositing work that they have to do during the last kind of big segment in which the troll and the cat are fighting kind of like on Drew Barrymore's chest, basically on her bed, has not stood the test of time. It's pretty rough looking, that compositing, but I like the idea. I do like what you're saying. I think because we get to spend a lot more time with this family and there's a lot more conflict thrown into the story.
Yeah, you get much more of the family dynamic in this than I think you do in either of the other stories. In Quitters Inc., you're like, okay, but what is this guy's relationship with his family really like? You kind of just see him glazed over every time he's at home. And you're like, oh, okay, all right, he clearly needs some coffee. That's all the wife says.
Yeah, the story's not about his family. It's solely about him. So his family is so peripheral to what else is going on. It's the same thing
True.
in The Ledge with Robert Hayes and whatever his relationship with Kressner's wife is. But in general, we get stuff like they don't want them to, the parents don't want Drew Barrymore to keep the cat indoors because they think it's violent. And there's some fun intercutting where they're having that discussion where, Drew Barrymore's like, General's not violent. He wouldn't hurt a fly. Cut to him outside, tackling a bird. And when they think that he's the one causing all of this trouble, they send him to be euthanized at a kill shelter, which is like, oh no. So I like that conflict. I like that General does come off as a character, like, beyond just the, oh, if you like cats, you're going to be worried for a cat type, easy emotional stuff. There's an actual bit of narrative work done to make us like General and see that he's going to protect Drew Barrymore. And I think if you separated this from the movie and just had it as its own little thing, its own little short film or its own little episode, it would probably be remembered way more fondly than kind of the tail end of a pretty shaky feature film.
Yeah, I think because of that lack of cohesiveness with the stories, in Creepshow, they all at least have this similar tone to them. And these just feel like such drastically different stories that the only connection is the cat. And because the cat doesn't really matter much in the first two stories, you're like, okay, cool, there's a cat. He trips a dude, and then you finally get the story for the cat.
Yeah, I mean, Creepshow has the great thing of it has a wraparound story. It has kind of a bookend story that's then, the only thing that links them together is that this comic book, that these are all stories in a comic book. With this, they're trying to build up the cat as an actual character in other situations, and that never quite works. And
Right.
and again, I think it really comes down to direction. And I like Louis Teague a lot. Like, I love Cujo. I love Alligator. But I don't think he was the right person for this material. I'm sure that they got him because he had just done Cujo, and Cujo was very successful, both, financially and critically. And it's like, oh yeah, and Stephen King was very happy with how Cujo turned out. So I'm sure he was happy to be part of the process with his screenplay. But I think that this needs that kind of go for broke tone to really make it stick, because otherwise I think the limitations of these as short stories shine through more.
Absolutely. And, this wasn't my favorite adaptation by any means. And like you said, The General would have been a better story on its own. And there aren't too many shorts that I think I'm probably going to include in this podcast. I know that I have the Lawnmower Man set just because I feel like that's a much better adaptation to talk about than the movie that, involved Stephen King suing the guys to get his name taken off of it and all that fun stuff. Like, I'm not even going to touch those movies because I know they don't have anything to do with the actual story. But yeah, I actually haven't really looked into the shorts that much. So when you get something like Creepshow or Cat's Eye, it's like, okay, I could see how certain shorts could work and some could not, even though, you know, Creepshow really felt like something as a whole, whereas this didn't. And it was a little disappointing when I was going through. I was like, oh, I thought these stories were going to relate to each other a little more. And because I didn't remember too much about the Ledge and the General was something new, I knew nothing about that story. And so because Stephen King is so good at connecting things, I was like, oh, that wasn't what I was expecting.
Yeah, I think if you look at King's output, like television output, like I know I'm pretty sure he did a couple of episodes for Tales from the Dark Side. He's done at least one episode I know from the 80s revival of the Twilight Zone. I think the stuff in Cat's Eye kind of falls into that arena where it's like, you know, if these had been their own episodes of a TV show, like not trying to connect each other, I think they'd be fine. I think they'd all be like, yeah, that was solid enough. But that's what it feels like. It doesn't feel like a cohesive movie. It just feels like these were kind of, I tried to get these, adapted for another show and they didn't work out. So we'll just use them in this movie.
Yeah, that's definitely what it felt like. And I know there are other anthologies that I'll be discussing here, and Tales from the Dark Side is one of them, which you have signed up for. No surprise there.
Oh yeah, if there's anthology stuff to be talked about, I'm always game.
And they're still doing that today. You know, they actually just announced a bunch of cast members for season 2 of Castle Rock. So in that instance, they're doing the anthology series in a different way. They're giving you a full season, a full story arc. You can flesh out these characters, and then the next season is going to be different characters. And, you know, they're bringing back Tim Robbins. I don't think they're bringing him back as his character from Shawshank because that was too long ago.
I think that's another fun kind of wink wink at the audience. And
yeah.
And I like that. Like I like that playfulness, you know, and I'm glad to see something like that. There's going to be a Creepshow series on Shudder, you know, and they're adapting short stories from King, but also like his son Joe Hill and other horror writers. And I'm like, I'm very glad to see that the two different approaches to anthology, you know, a big season long, you know, basically like feature arc that's trying to connect everything, and kind of the individual one-off episode stuff can still exist. And Cat's Eye is trying to marry the two, and I think it would have been better off if it just kind of picked one lane and stuck to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely looking forward to checking out the other original screenplays that Stephen King has written, because I know there's Storm of the Century and Rose Red, I believe, that he did himself. So there are some opportunities to see how he has improved on his screenwriting over the years throughout this podcast too. And that's something that I find exciting because, you know, obviously with as many books and movies as there are, he can't possibly write every single screenplay himself. Maybe he could. Not. Maybe he could. He does write so many books. He has so many books.
That's true. Yeah, I'm sure if somebody paid him enough.
But in a way, I'm kind of glad other people get to play with these stories, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a good note to end this episode on. You know, we kind of feel iffy about Cat's Eye, and that's understandable.
Yeah, it's a bummer because as I was watching, I'm like, you know, this would be like a good movie to show like a kid that was getting into Stephen King or interested in anthology or genre stuff. But then I'm like, yeah, but the first two stories really aren't framed well enough. It's like, just show them the general. Like, that's a great little bit to be like, hey, you want to see something cool? Just like fast forward to the last 20, 30 minutes of the movie and just show them that. And that works fine. I think that's a fun little standalone thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Drew, always a pleasure talking Stephen King with you.
Same.
And to our listeners, you can follow us at Chat Sematary on Twitter, and Instagram. You can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.